Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back, way back, to a time of towering monuments and sun-drenched sands, a place you've seen in movies and perhaps dreamed of visiting. We're heading to ancient Egypt. Imagine yourself, not as a powerful pharaoh or a revered priestess, but as someone, well, a bit more like you, plucked from your comfy modern life and dropped unceremoniously into the heart of Thebes, say around 1400 BCE. The air shimmers with heat, not from a gentle sunbeam through your window, but from a relentless, baking glare that reflects off the dusty ground and the muddy waters of the Nile. You can almost feel the grit between your teeth already. The sounds are a cacophony of unfamiliar shouts, braying donkeys and the distant thrum of something. And the smells? Let's just say they haven't invented air fresheners yet, or for that matter, modern plumbing. This isn't the gilded, serene Egypt of museum dioramas. And frankly, you probably won't survive this, at least not with your expectations intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're tuning in from, so drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink against the blinding Egyptian sun, your eyes struggling to adjust after, well, you're not quite sure after what. One moment, you are contemplating the ingredients for a late-night snack, and the next you're here, stumbling off a rough-hewn wooden barge onto a crowded, chaotic riverbank. The landing is less a pier, and more a muddy slide into mayhem. Barefoot children with shaved heads and single side locks of hair dart around your legs, shouting in a language that buzzes in your ears like a swarm of persistent insects. Men, their dark skins slick with sweat, strain under heavy loads, sacks of grain, bundles of reeds, large pottery jars that look impossibly fragile. Their loincloths, made of what appears to be coarse linen, are stained and cling uncomfortably in the oppressive heat. No one offers you a hand, no one smiles in welcome. Instead you receive curious, perhaps suspicious stares. You are very clearly not from around here. Your clothes, whatever they were, now feel alien and out of place, drawing unwanted attention. The air is thick, not just with heat, but with a potent cocktail of odours. There's the earthy, somewhat fishy smell of the vast river beside you, mingled with the sharper tang of animal dung, donkey, oxen, probably goat. Add to that the aroma of wood smoke from countless small fires, something acrid and unfamiliar that might be burning dried reeds, and an underlying pervasive scent of unwashed humanity. It's a far cry from the subtle notes of your favourite scented candle, isn't it? You take a tentative step forward, your modern shoes, if you still have them, sinking slightly into the sun-baked mud now mixed with who knows what. Welcome to Thebes, the mighty Waset, one of the ancient world's great metropolises. It just doesn't have a welcome committee with a fruit basket for newcomers, more's the pity. You'd imagined perhaps wide, palm-lined avenues, gleaming white temples, and people gliding by in serene golden splendour. The reality hitting you now is a jumble of low, mud-brick buildings huddled closely together. Their walls are dusty brown that blends into the parched earth. Narrow, unpaved alleyways, more like dusty trenches, disappear between them, hinting at a maze-like interior. In the distance, a colossal stone structure pierces the hazy sky, perhaps part of the great temple complex of Karnak you've read about. But from here, it seems less a beacon of civilization and more an imposing, almost threatening declaration of power you can't possibly comprehend or access. Thebes, during the New Kingdom, was indeed a powerhouse, a sprawling city that served as a religious heart and an administrative hub for a vast empire. Its population swelled with officials, priests, artisans, labourers, and like you, a constant stream of newcomers hoping to find something. As you try to get your bearings, a wiry old man with eyes that seem to have seen too much sun and too little joy mutters something at you, gesturing vaguely towards the denser part of the settlement. You don't understand his words, but the implication seems to be move along, don't block the thoroughfare. Thoroughfare? It's more like a goat track. You try a hesitant smile, but it's not returned. These people are busy, their lives etched with a hardship you're only just beginning to sense. The grandeur of Egypt, the stuff of documentaries and glossy coffee table books, was built on the backs of people like these, and now, apparently, people like you. A strange, almost unsettling quiet falls for a moment as a procession of shaven-headed priests in clean white linen walks by, their expressions aloof and unreadable. They carry small, ornate boxes, and the crowd instinctively parts, heads bowed. The reverence is palpable, a reminder that the gods here are not distant concepts but immediate, powerful forces. You also notice some individuals furtively touching amulets, or making small gestures as the priests pass. Perhaps they're warding off ill luck. You later learn that some areas of any large Egyptian city, especially near necropolises or certain industrial zones, were believed to be haunted by mischievous or even malevolent spirits, the kinds of city demons that a newcomer might unwittingly offend. Definitely no tourist map highlighting those particular attractions. The sheer effort of just standing, of processing this overwhelming sensory input, is exhausting. The sun beats down, and you realise you have no water, no food, no shelter, and absolutely no idea what to do next. This isn't a quaint historical reenactment where you can tap out when things get too authentic. This is it. Your 5-star all-inclusive Nile cruise has apparently been downgraded somewhat significantly. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian newcomer to a large city like Thebes would have found immediate kinship through shared regional origins, perhaps a village network transplanted to the city, or faced intense cutthroat competition for even the most menial work and a scrap of floor to sleep on. Looking at the hard faces around you, you suspect it might be the latter. The welcome to ancient Thebes is harsh, unforgiving, and deeply, deeply unsettling. Your adventure has begun, and the primary objective, it seems, is simply to make it through the next hour. The old man who shooed you along has already disappeared into the throng, and you're left standing, feeling the oppressive heat radiate not just from the sky, but also from the packed earth beneath your feet. Your gaze is inevitably drawn to the massive, sluggish river beside you. The Nile. It's not the sparkling blue ribbon you might have seen on satellite images. Up close, it's a vast expanse of muddy brown water, the colour of milky tea, or perhaps a latte that's been left out a bit too long. It stretches wider than you anticipated, a formidable, almost overwhelming presence. Small papyrus skiffs, looking perilously flimsy, are poled through the shallows, their occupants seemingly oblivious to the current that tugs at their simple vessels. The air coming off the water isn't exactly refreshing. It carries that same earthy, slightly fishy tang you noticed earlier, mixed with the scent of damp reeds and decaying vegetation along the banks. You can hear the gentle lapping of water against the muddy shore, a rhythmic sigh that underscores all the other city sounds. This is Happy, the god, the lifeblood, the great provider, and, as you're about to discover, a bit of a demanding boss with a nasty temper. You know, intellectually, that the Nile is the reason Egypt exists, the source of its legendary fertility. Each year, for millennia, this river has performed a miracle. Swollen by rains far to the south, in lands you can't even imagine, it would burst its banks, flooding the narrow strip of land on either side. This inundation, the season of Akhet, was the cornerstone of Egyptian life. When the waters receded, they left behind a thick layer of incredibly fertile black silt, a natural fertilizer so potent it allowed for bountiful harvests year after year in an otherwise arid desert. This silt was Egypt's black gold. Without it, there would be no pyramids, no pharaohs, no grand temples, just endless sand. So yes, the Nile is a blessing, an undeniable, civilization-creating marvel. You can almost feel a sense of ancient gratitude emanating from the very land itself. But that blessing comes at a steep price, payable daily in sweat and toil. As you watch a woman, no older than yourself, rhythmically dip a heavy clay pot into the river, then strain to lift it onto her shoulder before trudging up the bank, you get your first glimpse of the Nile's other side. Fetching water is a constant, relentless chore. There are no taps here, no convenient indoor plumbing. Every drop of water for drinking, cooking, washing, such as it is, and for countless small-scale irrigation efforts comes directly from this river, hauled by hand, pot by pot, day in and day out. It's like an extreme version of that farmer's walk exercise at the gym, except it's not optional, and there's no protein shake waiting for you afterwards. And it's not just fetching water for the household. If you end up working the land, which is highly probable for someone in your unexpected situation, you'll become intimately familiar with the shaduf. This ingenious, yet labour-intensive contraption, a long wooden pole balanced on a fulcrum with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, is used to lift water from canals or the river itself into irrigation channels. It's back-breaking work under that unforgiving sun, hour after hour just to keep the precious crops alive. The Nile gives, but it demands much in return. Then there are the more overt dangers. You peer a little closer at the water's edge, noticing the dense thickets of papyrus reeds. They look rather picturesque, but you recall stories about what lurks within. Crocodiles, for instance. The Nile crocodile is not a cuddly cartoon character. It's a prehistoric predator, perfectly adapted to this environment, and it views anything near the water's edge as a potential meal. Laundry day by the river could turn into an extreme sport you didn't sign up for. Historians note that amulets depicting Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and protection, were incredibly popular, perhaps in part because hippos, while seemingly placid herbivores, were, and are, notoriously aggressive and responsible for more human deaths in Africa than many other large animals. You can just imagine one of those surprisingly agile multi-ton behemoths deciding your little papyrus skiff is in its way. The ancient Egyptians had a healthy respect, tinged with fear, for the creatures sharing their river. Some even believed that consuming certain parts of a crocodile, like its fat or bile, could impart strength or offer protection, though you probably wouldn't want to be the one tasked with acquiring those ingredients. And if the fauna doesn't get you, the water itself might. That muddy water, so vital for life, is also a breeding ground for a host of delightful microscopic organisms. Schistosomiasis, a debilitating parasitic disease caused by flatworms that live in fresh water, was rampant in ancient Egypt. The worm's larvae penetrate the skin of people wading or working in infected water. Lovely. Then there are the usual waterborne suspects: dysentery, typhoid, and other gastrointestinal nightmares that could easily turn fatal without modern medicine. You look at the children splashing merrily in the shallows, and a wave of unease washes over you. The Nile's gift of life is intertwined with the constant threat of disease and early death. It's an all-inclusive package, but not the kind you'd book on a travel website. Historians still argue whether the complex system of basin irrigation, which ingeniously trapped and distributed the floodwaters, was centrally managed by the state from the earliest dynasties or evolved more organically from local community efforts, gradually being scaled up and formalized over centuries. Either way, it represented a monumental, ongoing human effort to harness the Nile's power. For you, standing on its banks, it's less an abstract agricultural system and more a very real, very large and very ambivalent entity. It's the source of your potential food, your inevitable labour, and a significant number of things that could make your involuntary trip to the past exceedingly short and unpleasant. The sun continues to beat down, the muddy water continues its slow, implacable journey to the sea, and you realise that this river will dominate every single aspect of your existence here. There is no escaping the Nile. It is the beginning, the middle, and for many the end of life in ancient Egypt. Following the vague gesture of the old man, and with a dawning, sinking feeling that this is your new reality, you turn your back on the overwhelming presence of the Nile and venture into the warren of dusty alleyways that make up the residential quarter of Thebes. If you thought the riverbank was chaotic, this is a whole new level of bewildering. The pathways are narrow, twisting and unpaved, more like ruts carved into the earth by countless feet and the occasional passing donkey. The air here is even thicker, trapped between the close-set buildings, heavy with the smells of cooking fires, unidentifiable refuse, and the close proximity of many, unwashed bodies. You have to constantly watch your step to avoid tripping over loose stones, discarded pottery shards, or small piles of, well, you try not to look too closely. Let's just say sanitation standards are what you might charitably call pre-industrial. After a bewildering series of turns, following someone who seems to know where they're going, or at least walks with more confidence than you feel, you arrive at what is apparently to be your new home. Don't expect a welcoming committee or a fresh coat of paint. What stands before you is a small rectangular structure made of sun-dried mud bricks. These bricks, fashioned from Nile mud, mixed with straw or sand and baked hard under the relentless Egyptian sun, are the ubiquitous building material for common housing. They're cheap, readily available, and, well, they're mud. The walls are uneven, the colour of dust, and look like they might crumble if you leaned against them too hard. There are no gleaming white limestone blocks here. Those are reserved for temples and tombs of the very important. This is strictly economy class. The doorway is a low dark opening, perhaps covered by a tattered reed mat that serves as a door. You have to duck to enter, stepping from the harsh glare of the outside into a gloomy interior. Your eyes take a moment to adjust, and as they do, the reality of your new dwelling begins to sink in. The floor is simply packed earth, uneven and cool underfoot if you are barefoot, which you soon will be. There are no windows as you know them, perhaps a few small high openings near the roofline, more like ventilation slits, which do little to dispel the gloom or the smoky air. The roof itself is likely made of wooden poles overlaid with palm fronds, reeds, and a layer of mud. You can just imagine how delightful that would be during a rare but not unheard of rain shower. Drip, drip, splat. The space is compact. Incredibly compact. Maybe one or two small rooms if you're lucky. A typical commoner's house might consist of a front room for general activities, perhaps a slightly more private sleeping area, and if they were relatively well off, a small courtyard at the back for cooking or keeping a few animals like chickens or a goat. But for a newcomer like you, you're probably looking at a single, multi-purpose space shared with several other people. Privacy is a luxury you've just left behind in the 21st century. You can already hear the snuffles and rustlings of other occupants, though you can't quite make them out in the dim light. The air inside is thick with the smell of stale sweat, old cooking smoke that has nowhere to go, and a faint underlying mustiness that speaks of damp and poor ventilation. You try to take a deep breath and instantly regret it. In one corner you might see a simple clay oven, or a hearth, a blackened patch on the wall above it betraying its constant use. This is where the daily bread will be baked, coarse, gritty, and essential. Scattered around are a few basic possessions, rough pottery for storage and cooking, maybe a few woven baskets, and some reed mats that serve as all-purpose furniture. For sitting, for sleeping, for working. Forget comfy sofas or memory foam mattresses. Your bed will likely be a mat on the hard earth, perhaps with a wooden headrest if you're fancy. These headrests, often depicted in tomb paintings, look incredibly uncomfortable to modern necks, but were standard sleeping equipment. Perhaps they helped keep your head away from scorpions and other nocturnal crawlies that might share your floor space. Sweet dreams. Speaking of uninvited guests, your mud hut is not exactly a hermetically sealed environment. Gaps in the walls, the porous nature of the mud bricks themselves, and the open doorway mean you'll be sharing your living space with a variety of creatures. Insects are a given. Flies, mosquitoes, especially near the river, and various beetles. You might also encounter the occasional scorpion seeking shade, or a snake slithering in through a crack. Rodents, attracted by any stored food, would also be common. One popular, though rather gross, ancient Egyptian remedy for keeping mice away involved smearing your house with cat fat. Where one procures cat fat is a question you'd rather not ponder right now. Good luck with that. The general level of hygiene is also something that will take considerable adjustment. Without running water or a sewage system, waste disposal is rudimentary. Household waste might be thrown into the alleyway or into communal refuse pits if the settlement is slightly more organised. Personal ablutions are often performed using a pot, the contents of which are then disposed of similarly. This, combined with the close proximity of animals, creates an environment ripe for the spread of disease. You suddenly appreciate your boring old bathroom with its flushing toilet and hot and cold running water more than you ever thought possible. Historians still argue whether the layout of ancient Egyptian villages and urban residential areas followed any deliberate town planning, or simply grew organically, with houses crammed into any available space. Looking around your new cramped neighbourhood, you're leaning towards the organic cramming theory. As your eyes fully adjust to the gloom, you might discern other figures in the hut. A woman, her face weary, tends to a small smoky fire. A couple of children, their bodies thin, play quietly with some pebbles in a corner. They glance at you, their expressions unreadable, before returning to their game. There are no words of welcome, no introductions. You're simply another body occupying this small shared space. The lack of personal space, the dimness, the smoke, the smells, the constant presence of dirt and potential disease vectors. This is the reality of your new home. It's a far cry from any idyllic image of ancient life. This mud hut, basic and bleak, is where your Egyptian story will unfold, a daily testament to the harsh realities faced by the vast majority of people who lived and died under the pharaohs. The smoky, cramped interior of your mud brick dwelling offers little respite from the oppressive reality of ancient Thebes, but it is for now your designated shelter. You don't get much time to acclimatise, however. Before the sun has even fully climbed into the sky, painting the dusty horizon with hues of orange and pink, the household is stirring. There's no gentle alarm clock, no snooze button here. The first rays of light filtering feebly through those high slits in the wall are the signal to begin the day. Or perhaps it's the persistent crowing of a distant rooster, or the braying of a neighbour's donkey impatient for its own day of toil to commence. Either way, the message is clear. It's time to work. As a new, unskilled addition to this society, your path is almost certainly leading you to the fields. Welcome to the life of an Egyptian peasant farmer, where your days are governed by the sun, the seasons, and the unyielding demands of the land. You stumble out of the hut, still bleary-eyed, into the cool pre-dawn air. The coolness won't last. Even now you can feel the promise of the heat to come. Others are already moving through the narrow alleyways, shadowy figures heading towards the fertile strip of land that borders the Nile. There's a quiet purposefulness to their movements, a resignation perhaps. This is the rhythm of their lives, a rhythm you must now learn. You're likely given a piece of coarse, gritty bread, your breakfast, and perhaps a sip of water or weak, sour beer from a communal jar. Don't expect a leisurely brunch. Food is fuel, and you need to get to the fields before the sun reaches its zenith and makes labour unbearable. As you reach the cultivated land, a patchwork of green fields stretching out from the riverbank, the scale of the agricultural enterprise becomes apparent. This isn't a quaint little vegetable patch. This is the breadbasket of a kingdom. The black fertile soil, the gift of the Nile, is precious, and it requires constant attention. Depending on the season, your tasks will vary, but they all share a common denominator. They are relentlessly physical. If it's planting season, you might be tasked with scattering seeds, wheat, barley, or perhaps flax for linen, or you could be part of a team ploughing the fields. The ancient Egyptian plough was a simple, light affair, usually pulled by a pair of oxen, or sometimes even by men if draft animals were scarce. Your job might be to guide the plough, a jolting, jarring task that strains your arms and back, or to walk alongside, breaking up clods of earth with a heavy wooden hoe. The hoe, a basic T-shaped tool, will become an extension of your body, your constant companion in the fight against weeds and compacted soil. If it's harvest time, the work is even more intense. You'll be cutting grain with a small curved sickle, its flint or bronze blade surprisingly sharp. This involves hours of stooping, slicing and gathering, your muscles screaming in protest. The cut grain is then bundled into sheaves and transported, often on donkey back or by human porters, to the threshing floor. Threshing itself is another exhausting process, where oxen or donkeys are driven round and round over the stalks to separate the grain from the chaff. Then comes winnowing, where the threshed grain is tossed into the air with wooden scoops, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls to the ground. You'll be covered in dust and chaff, your throat dry, your eyes stinging. It's a scene repeated countless times in tomb paintings, a testament to its fundamental importance. The successful harvest meant survival, for your family and for Egypt. A failed harvest meant hunger, and perhaps starvation. The stakes are always high. Throughout the day the sun climbs higher, beating down mercilessly. There is little shade in the open fields. You might wear a simple linen cloth wrapped around your head, or perhaps nothing at all. Your skin, unused to such exposure, will quickly burn. Remember that crocodile-dung sunscreen. Maybe it wasn't such a joke after all, though finding a crocodile willing to donate might be tricky. You learn to pace yourself, to drink water sparingly when it's available, often from a shared jar brought to the fields. Breaks are few and short, just enough time to catch your breath before the overseer, a stern figure often depicted in Egyptian art carrying a rod or a whip, urges you back to work. While extreme brutality wasn't necessarily the everyday norm for agricultural workers, dead peasants can't harvest grain after all. The threat of punishment for laziness or insubordination was ever present. The concept of a workers' rights movement is about 3,500 years in your future. One slightly quirky agricultural practice you might encounter is the use of trained baboons to help harvest fruit from tall trees, like date palms or fig trees. Tomb scenes occasionally depict these primates clambering among the branches, picking fruit and sometimes cheekily eating some of it themselves. While you probably won't be training any baboons, it's a reminder of the ingenuity and resourcefulness of ancient farmers in utilising every available asset. Don't try this at home with your local squirrel population though, it probably won't end well. The work is repetitive, mind-numbingly so. Hoeing, weeding, watering, ploughing, reaping, the cycle repeats, dictated by the Nile's inundation and the needs of the crops. There's a certain rhythm to it, a connection to the earth, but it's a connection forged through sheer, unadulterated hard labour. You feel your muscles ache in ways you never knew they could. Blisters form on your hands, then burst, then form calluses. Your back develops a permanent stoop. This isn't a get-fit-quick scheme. It's a wear-your-body-down-slowly reality. Historians still argue whether the majority of agricultural land was owned directly by the pharaoh and temples, with peasants working as serfs or tenants, or if there was a significant class of small, independent landholders. For you, toiling under the sun, the exact legal status of the land probably matters less than the immediate crushing weight of the labour itself. As the sun finally begins to dip towards the western desert, casting long shadows across the fields, the workday slowly winds down. You trudge back to your mud hut, exhausted, caked in dust and sweat, every muscle crying out for rest. There's no hot shower waiting, no comfortable armchair to sink into, just the same smoky, cramped space, a meagre evening meal, and then a few precious hours of sleep before the cycle begins anew. Dawn till dusk, your life is now a relentless routine of physical exertion, a stark contrast to the sedentary comforts you once knew. The ancient wonders of Egypt were built upon this foundation of endless, anonymous toil, and you are now a part of that unglamorous, exhausting truth. After a day of back-breaking labour in the fields, every muscle singing a chorus of complaint, you might imagine a hearty, satisfying meal awaits you back in your mud brick abode. You'd do well to temper those expectations, perhaps significantly. The culinary landscape for an ordinary ancient Egyptian like yourself is, shall we say, less about Michelin stars and more about basic, often monotonous sustenance. The bounty of the Nile, while impressive in its agricultural output, doesn't always translate into a diverse or luxurious diet for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Your meals will be simple, repetitive, and primarily aimed at providing enough calories to get you through another day of toil. Forget exotic spices and elaborate sauces. Think functional fuel. The absolute staples of your diet, the daily double act that will form the bedrock of most of your meals, are bread and beer. But this isn't the artisanal sourdough and craft IPA you might be accustomed to. Ancient Egyptian bread, often made from emmer wheat or barley, was coarse, dense, and frequently gritty. The methods used for grinding grain, often involving rubbing stones together, meant that tiny particles of sand and stone inevitably found their way into the flour. This resulted in significant tooth wear, a common problem seen in Egyptian mummies. So enjoy that satisfying crunch in your bread. It's just a little bit of Egypt itself, slowly grinding down your enamel. Yum. Bread was typically baked in simple clay ovens, or even directly in hot ashes, resulting in flatbreads or small dense loaves. It was filling, certainly, but probably not something you'd write home about, even if you had a postal service and a home to write to. Accompanying your daily bread is its liquid counterpart, beer. Heneket, as the Egyptians called it, was a fundamental part of the diet for everyone, from labourers to pharaohs, though the quality and strength would vary enormously. For common folk like you, the beer would likely be thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol content, more like a fermented barley gruel than a refreshing lager. It was made by crumbling partially baked bread into water and allowing it to ferment. Because it was unfiltered, it would contain barley husks and other solids, making it quite chewy. It was often drunk through a straw, possibly to filter out some of the larger bits. While it might sound unappetizing, this beer was a crucial source of calories, vitamins, and hydration. It was also generally safer to drink than untreated river water, thanks to the fermentation process. So, cheers to that, I suppose. You'll quickly get used to starting your day with bread and beer, having it for your midday meal in the fields, and finishing your day with, you guessed it, more bread and beer. What about some fresh produce, you ask? Vegetables would have been a welcome, though not always abundant addition to your diet. Onions and garlic were mainstays, prized for their flavour and, perhaps, their perceived medicinal properties. You might also encounter leeks, radishes, lettuces, though the ancient Egyptian lettuce was a tall, spiky variety associated with the god Min and considered an aphrodisiac. Make of that what you will. Cucumbers, and various types of gourds and melons, especially in season. These would often be eaten raw or perhaps lightly cooked in stews if you had a pot and something to stew them with. Pulses like lentils and chickpeas were also important sources of protein, often boiled into a thick pottage. These would add some much-needed variety and nutrients to your carbohydrate-heavy meals. Fruit was more of a seasonal treat. Dates, figs, and grapes were common and could be eaten fresh or dried for later use. Pomegranates and the fruit of the sycamore fig tree were also enjoyed. However, for a peasant labourer, these might be luxuries, something to look forward to rather than a daily expectation. You certainly wouldn't be finding a neatly arranged fruit platter waiting for you after a hard day's work. You might get lucky and find some wild-growing berries or nuts, but foraging takes time and energy you might not have. Meat and fish? Now we're venturing into more aspirational territory for the average Egyptian. Fish from the Nile, tilapia, catfish, mullet, would have been the most accessible form of animal protein for commoners. It could be eaten fresh, but was often dried or salted to preserve it, making it a rather pungent but long-lasting food source. You might see fishermen out on their papyrus skiffs using nets, hooks, or spears, but even then, a good catch might be sold at market rather than consumed by the fisherman's own family if they needed the income. Poultry, such as ducks and geese, were raised, but again, a roasted duck was more likely to grace the table of a wealthy official than your humble mat. Beef was a high-status food, generally reserved for temple offerings, the elite, or special festive occasions. If you were lucky, you might get a small share of sacrificial meat from a temple festival, but don't count on regular steak nights. One rather unusual source of protein, confirmed by archaeological finds in workers' villages, was pig. Though Herodotus claimed Egyptians abhorred swine, evidence suggests pork was consumed, particularly by the working classes. So, a bit of bacon might not be entirely out of the question, though it probably wouldn't be the crispy, streaky kind you're dreaming of. The preparation of food would be simple. Cooking was done over an open fire or in a clay oven using basic pottery. Spices, apart from things like coriander or cumin, which were grown locally, were expensive and rare. Salt was available, sourced from desert deposits or coastal lagoons, and was vital for preserving food as well as for flavour. Honey was the primary sweetener, but it was a valuable commodity, often controlled by temples or wealthy estates. You might get a taste of it occasionally, but mostly your food would be on the savoury and perhaps bland side. Historians still argue whether the beer and bread diet, so prominent in official ration lists for state workers, like those building pyramids or tombs, accurately reflects the full dietary range of the general populace, or if it overlooks a greater reliance on foraging, fishing and small-scale gardening for supplementary foods. Looking at your meagre portion of gritty bread and watery beer, you certainly hope there's something else on offer. The gnawing feeling of hunger, or at least the absence of true satiation, might become a familiar companion. Your meals are designed to keep you going, not to delight your palate. The joy of food, the exploration of flavours, the comfort of a well-cooked meal. These are luxuries that your current station in ancient Egyptian life doesn't readily afford. You eat what's available, you're grateful for it, and you hope it's enough to give you the strength for tomorrow. The exotic feasts depicted in tomb paintings, laden with roasted meats, piles of fruit, and delicate cakes, are a world away from your daily reality. For you, dinner is served, and it looks a lot like breakfast. Surviving the daily grind of manual labour on a diet of coarse bread and weak beer is one thing. Navigating the myriad of health hazards in ancient Egypt with virtually no understanding of germ theory is quite another. Personal hygiene, as you once knew it, is a distant, almost forgotten dream. Here, staying clean is a constant struggle, and the available remedies for ailments often blur the line between medicine, magic, and frankly, utter desperation. You're about to get a very personal introduction to ancient Egyptian healthcare, and it's not for the faint of heart, or stomach. Your day likely begins and ends not with a refreshing shower or a long soak in a tub, but with a more rudimentary attempt at cleanliness. If you're near the Nile or an irrigation canal, you might use its water to wash your face and hands. Remember all those delightful parasites like schistosomiasis we discussed? Yes, that water. Some wealthier Egyptians had designated areas in their homes for washing, perhaps a screened-off corner with a limestone slab to stand on, while water was poured over them from a jar. For you, in your shared mud hut, such refinements are unlikely. A quick splash, if you're lucky, is the order of the day. Soap, as we know it, doesn't exist. Egyptians did use natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate harvested from dry lake beds, as a cleansing agent. It's alkaline and has some absorbent properties, so it could help cut through grease and grime. They also used oils, sometimes scented, to cleanse and moisturise the skin, which would have been essential in the dry, dusty climate. But access to large quantities of natron or scented oils might be limited for someone of your lowly status. Dental hygiene is another area where your modern sensibilities will be sorely tested. We already mentioned the gritty bread and its effect on tooth enamel. Egyptians did make efforts to clean their teeth, sometimes using frayed twigs as rudimentary toothbrushes or rinsing with natron solutions. Archaeologists have even found evidence of early dental fillings, though whether these were effective or merely cosmetic is debatable. Despite these efforts, dental problems like abscesses, cavities and periodontal disease were rampant, often leading to excruciating pain and systemic infections. Just imagine a toothache without access to painkillers or a qualified dentist. Your options might involve a magical incantation, the application of a poultice made of unappetizing ingredients, or, in extreme cases, a rather brutal extraction with primitive tools. You suddenly feel a deep appreciation for your twice-yearly dental checkups. Then there's the issue of general sanitation, or the distinct lack thereof. Remember those alleyways serving as open refuse dumps and occasionally latrines? Flies swarm everywhere, feasting on decaying organic matter, and then happily landing on your food, your face, your open wounds. This is a perfect recipe for the spread of diseases like dysentery, cholera, and various eye infections. Trachoma, a bacterial infection of the eye that can lead to blindness, was incredibly common in ancient Egypt, exacerbated by dust, flies, and close living conditions. You see many people with red, inflamed eyes, or even with milky, sightless pupils. It's a stark reminder of the daily battle against invisible enemies. When you inevitably fall ill or injure yourself, and given your new lifestyle, it's a matter of when, not if, you'll encounter the ancient Egyptian approach to medicine. It was a fascinating and sometimes terrifying blend of empirical observation, religious belief and magical ritual. Doctors, known as sabtaniyukshan, pronounced Sunu, did exist. Some specialised, much like today. There were shepherds of the anus, proctologists if you will, eye doctors and even dentists. They observed symptoms, diagnosed illnesses and prescribed treatments. Medical papyri, like the Ebers Papyrus or the Edwin Smith Papyrus, detail a surprising range of ailments and their proposed remedies. The Edwin Smith Papyrus in particular is remarkably rational for its time, dealing with traumatic injuries in a systematic way, even noting when a condition is untreatable. This document, for example, contains the first known descriptions of cranial sutures, the meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid. A truly remarkable piece of ancient medical literature. However, many treatments relied heavily on ingredients that might make you blanch. Remember that crocodile-dung sunscreen idea? Well, animal excrement, from donkeys, gazelles, even flies, featured prominently in various remedies, often mixed with other substances like honey, milk, or plant matter. The idea might have been that such repellent substances would drive out the evil spirits or humours thought to cause the disease. Lizard blood, swine's teeth, decomposing meat, and mouldy bread, which serendipitously might have contained penicillin-like antibiotics, a genuine quirky but true tidbit, were also on the ancient Egyptian pharmacy's shelf. Amulets inscribed with magical spells were worn to ward off sickness, and incantations were recited during the application of treatments. The lines between priest, magician and doctor were often blurred. For instance, a common treatment for a simple cough might involve inhaling the smoke from burning a mixture of dates, cassia, and an old papyrus scroll on which a magical formula had been written. Does it work? Well, it certainly keeps things interesting. And then there were the internal parasites. Beyond schistosomiasis, roundworms, tapeworms, and guinea worms were common unwelcome guests, contracted through contaminated food or water, or by walking barefoot on infected soil. The symptoms could range from general malaise and malnutrition to severe pain and debilitation. Treatments for these often involved ingesting potent purgatives or specific herbs believed to expel the worms. You can only imagine how pleasant that experience would be. Historians still argue whether the more outlandish ingredients in Egyptian medical prescriptions were primarily symbolic, intended to harness magical properties, or if some, through trial and error, were found to have genuine, albeit poorly understood, pharmacological effects. Looking at a recipe calling for mouse cooked in fat, you might lean towards the mostly magic interpretation, or at least hope so. The sheer number of things that could go wrong with your body in this environment is staggering. Minor cuts and abrasions, easily treated today with antiseptic and a bandage, could quickly become infected and life-threatening. The heat, the dust, the flies, the close contact with animals and the rudimentary sanitation all conspire against your well-being. You're constantly vulnerable, your immune system under siege from a host of unfamiliar pathogens. Staying healthy in ancient Egypt isn't just a matter of eating your greens. It's a daily precarious balancing act where a small misstep could have serious consequences, and the available cures might just make you wish you'd taken your chances with the disease. While your internal health is under constant assault from ancient germs and questionable cures, your external presentation, your clothing and any attempts at personal adornment also comes with its own set of ancient Egyptian peculiarities. Forget breathable cotton, stretchy spandex or weatherproof Gore-Tex. Your wardrobe in this new ancient life will be defined by one primary fabric, linen, and your attempts at fitting in with local beauty standards might involve some surprisingly risky cosmetic choices. Linen, made from the fibres of the flax plant, was the textile of choice in ancient Egypt. You've probably seen it in the fields, a delicate plant with blue flowers and toiled in its cultivation. Once harvested, the flax stalks undergo a lengthy process of retting, soaking to loosen the fibres, scutching, beating to remove the woody parts, and heckling, combing to separate the fibres, before they can be spun into thread and woven into cloth. It's a labour-intensive process, often carried out by women. The resulting fabric can range from very coarse, almost burlap-like material, to incredibly fine, almost transparent linen fit for royalty. Guess which end of the spectrum your daily attire will come from? For a common labourer like yourself, your clothing will be simple, practical, and made from the rougher grades of linen. Men typically wear a short kilt or loincloth, a basic rectangle of fabric wrapped around the hips and tied. Women might wear a simple, straight-sheath dress, sometimes with one or two shoulder straps, extending from below the bust to the ankles. Children often went entirely naked, especially in the warmer months, which, let's be honest, is most of them. These garments are designed for ease of movement and to offer some minimal protection from the sun and dust, but comfort isn't their primary selling point. The linen, especially the coarser varieties, can be scratchy against the skin, particularly when new or when caked with sweat and dirt from a long day's work. You'll miss the softness of your favourite t-shirt more than you can imagine. Laundry day, when it happens, involves taking your precious linen garments down to the Nile or a canal, beating them against rocks with wooden paddles, and rinsing them in that same parasite-rich water we've discussed. Soap, as mentioned, is not really a thing. Natron might be used if available, but often it's just a lot of vigorous scrubbing and rinsing. The clothes are then laid out on bushes or flat rocks to dry in the sun, which does have a natural bleaching and disinfecting effect. Still, your linen shifts will likely carry a permanent aroma of dust, sweat, and river water, and they won't stay pristine for long. The ubiquitous dust and mud mean that keeping clothes looking clean is an ongoing and often losing battle. You might own only one or two basic garments, wearing one while the other is being washed or waiting its turn. There's no expansive walk-in closet in your mud hut, that's for sure. Despite the simplicity of the clothing, ancient Egyptians, both men and women, were fond of personal adornment. Cosmetics were widely used, not just for beautification but also for magical protection and medicinal purposes. The most iconic ancient Egyptian makeup is kohl, the dark eyeliner seen in countless depictions. You'll see it on people from all walks of life. Kohl was made by grinding galena a lead sulfide for black coal or malachite, a copper carbonate for green eyeshadow, and mixing the powder with oil or fat to create a paste. It was applied around the eyes with a small stick, often made of wood, ivory or bone. This heavy eyeliner was believed to help deflect the harsh glare of the sun, repel flies, though how effective that was is debatable, given the fly's persistence, and even offer magical protection against the evil eye. However, while it might look striking, applying lead-based makeup around your eyes daily isn't exactly a modern dermatologist's top tip. Prolonged exposure to lead can have serious health consequences, including neurological damage. So, while you might be tempted to try it to blend in, or perhaps just to keep the sun out of your eyes, be aware that your ancient makeover comes with potential long-term risks. It's a bit like those old-timey remedies containing mercury or arsenic, fashionable at the time but with a nasty little surprise down the line. Another popular cosmetic was red ochre, a type of iron oxide clay, which was ground into a powder and mixed with water or fat to create a pigment used as a lipstick or rouge to colour the lips and cheeks. At least that one is less likely to poison you. Jewellery was also incredibly popular, worn by all social classes, though the materials varied wildly. Pharaohs and nobles dripped in gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. Commoners like yourself would have to make do with simpler adornments. You might wear necklaces, bracelets, or anklets made from faience, a type of glazed ceramic, often blue-green in colour, shells, polished stones, or even coloured glass beads. Amulets, offering protection or bringing good luck, were often incorporated into jewellery. The ankh, symbolising life, the scarab beetle, representing rebirth and protection, and the Eye of Horus, Wedjat Eye, for healing and protection, were particularly common. You might acquire a simple faience scarab amulet, hoping it offers some defence against the myriad dangers of your new life. It probably won't stop a charging hippo, but it might make you feel a little better. One rather quirky fashion trend among some ancient Egyptian women, particularly dancers and serving girls depicted in tomb paintings, was the perfume cone. This was a cone-shaped lump of perfumed animal fat or wax worn on top of the head, or on a wig. As the day, or the party, wore on, and the temperature rose, the cone would gradually melt, releasing its fragrance and coating the hair and shoulders with scented grease. Imagine that dripping down your neck in the midday sun. Refreshing. Perhaps not by modern standards. Historians still argue whether these perfume cones were actual wearable items or purely symbolic representations in art. Given the practicalities, you might hope for the latter, unless you enjoy the sensation of slowly melting greasy perfume running down your face. So, your daily attire is a scratchy linen shift, perhaps stained with a bit of yesterday's kohl that didn't quite wash off. Your feet are bare, or perhaps shod in simple reed sandals that offer minimal protection. You might have a string of faience beads around your neck. It's a far cry from fast fashion, but it's the uniform of your new existence. Practical, yes. Comfortable, not so much. And those alluring ancient cosmetics, they come with a health warning they forgot to write on the papyrus label. Beyond the daily struggles for sustenance, shelter, and basic hygiene, your life in ancient Egypt is also profoundly shaped by an unseen but ever-present force, the gods. This isn't a society where religion is a once-a-week affair or a private matter of personal belief. The Egyptian pantheon is vast, complex, and deeply integrated into every aspect of existence, from the grand, cosmic cycles of the sun and the Nile to the most mundane household chores. Appeasing these deities, ensuring their favour, and avoiding their wrath is a constant, pervasive preoccupation, often driven more by a sense of duty and fear than by heartfelt devotion. You don't just live in Egypt, you live in a world teeming with gods, spirits, and supernatural forces, and they all demand your attention. The sheer number of Egyptian gods is bewildering. There isn't a neat, organised list you can memorise. Major deities like Ra, the sun god, Osiris, god of the underworld, Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood, Horus, god of kingship and the sky, and Amun, king of the gods, especially prominent in Thebes, are just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them exists a seemingly endless array of minor gods, local deities specific to certain towns or regions, and demigods or divine beings associated with particular activities, natural phenomena, or even household objects. Bes, the grotesque but benevolent dwarf god, protected households and childbirth. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess you encountered earlier, also watched over pregnant women and newborns. There were gods for brewing, for writing, for weaving, for agriculture. It's like every aspect of life had its own divine supervisor, and you'd better hope you kept them all happy. For you, as an ordinary peasant, direct interaction with the major state gods in their magnificent temples is out of the question. The innermost sanctuaries of temples like Karnak or Luxor were restricted to high priests and the pharaoh himself. These vast temple complexes were not places of public congregation like a modern church or mosque. They were considered the literal homes of the gods on earth, and their divine residents required elaborate daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and anointing, performed by a dedicated priestly class. You might catch a glimpse of a religious procession during a major festival, when the cult statue of a god was paraded outside the temple walls, but that's as close as you'd likely get to the official state religion. You might make small offerings at an outer shrine, or pray at a public chapel dedicated to a particular deity, but the grand mysteries were far removed from your daily life. However, this doesn't mean you're off the divine hook. Your religious obligations are more personal, more local, and often more directly tied to your immediate well-being. You would likely have household shrines dedicated to ancestral spirits or minor protective deities. Small offerings of food, drink, or incense would be made regularly to keep these entities content. Amulets, as we've discussed, are vital. You'd wear them for protection against specific dangers: scorpions, snakes, illness, bad luck. These weren't just pretty trinkets. They were imbued with magical power, Heka, which was a fundamental force in the Egyptian cosmos, accessible to gods and humans alike, if you knew the right rituals. Certain days might be considered lucky or unlucky based on mythological events, and these would dictate what activities you should or shouldn't undertake. For example, the Epistle of Barnabas, though a later Christian text, preserves some of these Egyptian calendrical superstitions, noting days when it was unlucky to go on a journey or start a new venture. You'd need to be aware of this complex unwritten calendar of divine moods. Magic and religion are inextricably intertwined. If you fall ill, you might consult a priest of Sekhmet, the fearsome lioness goddess of plague and healing, for a cure. This cure would involve both medicinal remedies, remember the crocodile-dung and mouse fat, and magical incantations. If your crops are failing, you might make offerings to Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest, or chant spells to ward off pests. If you're about to undertake a dangerous journey, even a short one, you'd recite protective formulas. The world is full of unseen forces that can be influenced by the correct rituals and words of power. Failure to observe these practices could result in misfortune, illness, or even death. It's a constant low-level anxiety, a need to always be mindful of the supernatural realm. One rather quirky aspect of Egyptian popular religion was the oracular animal. Certain sacred animals, believed to be manifestations of a god, were kept in temples and consulted for their divine wisdom. For example, the Bushis bull at Armant, sacred to Montu, or the Apis bull at Memphis, sacred to Ptah, were revered. Questions might be posed to the animal, and its movements or choices, e.g., eating from one pile of food versus another, would be interpreted as divine answers. While you probably wouldn't be consulting the great Apis bull yourself, similar, smaller-scale divination practices involving animals or casting lots might be part of your local village life. You need to decide whether to plant barley or wheat this year. Perhaps the way the sacred goose in the village pond honks will give you a sign. Funerary beliefs, of course, play a massive role. The elaborate mummification and grand tombs you associate with ancient Egypt were primarily for the elite, but the core belief in an afterlife was shared by all. You too would hope for a successful journey to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. This required your K, life force, and Bay, soul or personality, to be sustained after death. While you wouldn't have a gilded sarcophagus, you'd still make provisions for your burial, however simple. Family members were responsible for maintaining funerary offerings for their deceased relatives, ensuring their continued existence in the afterlife. The dead were not truly gone. They were merely in another realm and could still influence the world of the living for good or ill. Neglected ancestors could become angry spirits, causing trouble for their descendants. So even after death, the demands continued. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian felt a deep personal piety towards their gods, or if their religious practices were largely performative, aimed at ensuring practical outcomes and maintaining social order. Looking around at the constant stream of small rituals, the ubiquitous amulets, and the genuine fear of divine retribution, it seems likely that for most, the gods were a very real and potent presence. Their demands were woven into the fabric of your days, the correct offerings, the whispered spells, the observance of sacred days and taboos. Your life is lived under their constant watchful eyes, and you obey, because the alternative, inviting their displeasure, is simply too terrifying to contemplate. This isn't about finding spiritual enlightenment, it's about spiritual risk management, ancient Egyptian style. While the gods might mete out divine justice in the afterlife, the pharaoh's earthly representatives are responsible for maintaining order and dispensing punishment in the here and now. And if you, as a commoner, find yourself on the wrong side of ancient Egyptian law, you're in for a decidedly unpleasant experience. The legal system, while possessing a framework of courts and procedures, is heavily weighted in favour of the state and the elite. Justice for people like you can be swift, harsh, and often brutal. Forget a jury of your peers or a high-powered defence attorney. You're more likely to encounter a stern-faced official, a few burly guards, and a range of rather persuasive interrogation techniques. The concept of mashat, cosmic order, truth, justice, and harmony, was central to Egyptian ideology. The pharaoh was tasked with upholding Mayat, and the legal system was, in theory, an extension of this divine principle. Laws, though not codified in a single, comprehensive legal document like Hammurabi's Code, at least none that has survived, did exist, derived from royal decrees, edicts, and long-standing customs. Local courts, known as kenbet, were presided over by community elders, priests or local officials. More serious cases might be escalated to higher regional courts, or even to the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, who was the ultimate judicial authority. So, on paper, there's a system. The reality on the ground for someone of your station, however, might be less about impartial justice and more about summary judgment. Imagine you're accused of a petty crime, perhaps stealing a loaf of bread because, let's face it, you're perpetually hungry, or maybe getting into a scuffle with a neighbour over a disputed boundary line between your miserable patches of dirt. There are no police officers as you know them to conduct a careful investigation. Witnesses might be called, but their testimony could be influenced by personal grudges, fear of authority, or the promise of a small reward. If you're lucky, you might get to plead your case before a local kenbet. But if the accuser is someone of higher status, or if the official presiding over the court has already made up his mind, your chances of a fair hearing diminish rapidly. Oaths played a significant role in legal proceedings. You would be required to swear an oath in the name of a god or the pharaoh, proclaiming your innocence. Breaking such an oath was considered a grave offence, inviting divine retribution as well as earthly punishment. However, the efficacy of this relied on the individual's fear of the gods outweighing their desire to escape punishment. If a case couldn't be decided based on testimony or evidence, sometimes an oracle might be consulted. Remember those oracular animals or divine statues? Yes, they could also play a role in the justice system, their pronouncements settling disputes or identifying culprits. It's a legal strategy that probably wouldn't hold up in modern courts, but here it's perfectly legitimate. The sacred baboon ate from the accuser's pile of grain, therefore the defendant is guilty. Case closed. If you are found guilty, or if the authorities simply decide you are, the punishments can be severe. Fines were common, often payable in goods like grain or livestock, which you likely don't have in abundance. For more serious offences or for repeat offenders, corporal punishment was a standard sentence. This could range from a beating with a rod, the bastinado, applied to the soles of the feet was a particular favourite, to more severe floggings that could leave a person permanently maimed or even dead. The number of blows was often specified, 50, 100, even 200 strokes. You see hardened criminals, or perhaps just unlucky individuals bearing the scars of such encounters, a visible warning to others. For crimes like theft from a temple or a tomb, a particularly heinous offence, or for serious assault or murder, the penalties were even more draconian. Mutilation, such as cutting off the nose, ears, or hands, was a common punishment, serving as a lifelong mark of shame and a deterrent to others. Forced labour, essentially a sentence of slow death, was another option. You could be condemned to work in the brutal desert mines, quarrying stone or mining for precious metals, under horrific conditions with little hope of survival. Imprisonment, as a long-term punishment, was less common than it is today. Ancient states generally didn't have the resources or inclination to maintain large prison populations. It was more efficient to punish swiftly and harshly, or to extract labour. The ultimate penalty, of course, was death. This could be carried out in various ways, including drowning, a particularly ignominious end as it denied the deceased a proper burial and thus jeopardized their afterlife: impalement or burning. There's a chilling record from the reign of Rameses IX detailing the punishment for tomb robbers. They were examined by beating with a stick. Their feet and hands were beaten. They took an oath by the Lord, LPH, life, prosperity, health, on pain of being beaten, of having their noses and ears cut off, and of being impaled. It doesn't leave much to the imagination. The state's power to inflict pain and death was absolute, and often very public. One rather quirky, or perhaps just grimly pragmatic aspect of the legal system was the use of judicial torture to extract confessions. If you were suspected of a crime, even without concrete evidence, you could be subjected to beatings or other forms of coercion to make you confess. The logic, presumably, was that an innocent person would withstand the pain, while a guilty one would break. Of course, the reality is that people will confess to almost anything under duress. So your innocence is no guarantee of safety if you fall under suspicion. Remember that stern-faced official and his burly guards? They're not just there for show. The Papyrus Salt 124, from the Ramesside period, details the investigation of a conspiracy within the royal harem and lists various officials and servants who were interrogated, very likely with coercive methods. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptian legal system was fundamentally aimed at achieving fairness and upholding ma'at for all, or if it primarily served as an instrument of state control, designed to protect the interests of the elite and suppress dissent among the masses. As you nervously eye the local magistrate, who seems to be looking at you with a distinct lack of benevolence, you might suspect the latter is closer to the truth. Your best strategy is to keep your head down, avoid trouble, and pray you never have cause to interact with the formal legal system. Justice in ancient Egypt is a formidable and often unforgiving beast, especially if you're on the menu. Just when you think your life as a peasant farmer, toiling from dawn till dusk for meagre rations, couldn't get any more demanding, a new and unwelcome opportunity arises: conscription. Not for the army, not yet anyway, but for one of the pharaoh's grand construction projects. Perhaps a new temple is being quojang, or a canal needs digging, or, most iconic of all, a pyramid or a grand tomb for a royal personage is underway. Suddenly, you, along with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of other able-bodied men from your village and surrounding region are rounded up and marched off to a new kind of labour. This isn't about tending your own small plot of land or contributing to the local harvest. This is about serving the god-king, the state, and building something monumental that you will likely never benefit from, nor even fully comprehend the purpose of. Welcome to the ancient Egyptian version of a pyramid scheme. And this one involves actual pyramids and a lot more physical exertion. The call for Corvée labour, as this system of compulsory unpaid work owed to the state is known, could come at any time, though it was often timed to coincide with the agricultural off-season, particularly during the Nile's inundation when farming was impossible. This was a practical measure, ensuring that the core agricultural work wasn't entirely disrupted. However, that doesn't make it any more appealing. One day you're worrying about your barley crop, the next you're being herded by overseers, leaving your family and your familiar mud hut behind for an unknown period, heading towards a destiny of stone, dust, and relentless hard work. There's no polite request, no option to decline. This is a royal decree, and refusal is not an option that ends well. You might get a small daily ration of bread, beer, and perhaps some dried fish or onions, the bare minimum to keep you functioning. But this is not a salaried position. Your destination could be a vast quarry in the desert hills, like Gebel el-Silsila for sandstone or Aswan for granite. Here, your job will be to hew massive blocks of stone from the earth. Imagine the scene. Hundreds, thousands of men, their bodies gleaming with sweat under the ferocious sun, chipping away at rock faces with primitive tools, copper or bronze chisels which blunted quickly and needed constant resharpening, stone pounders, wooden wedges. The noise would be deafening. The constant tap-tap-tapping of chisels, the thud of hammers, the shouts of overseers, the groaning of men straining to move immense weights. Dust would fill the air, coating everything, clogging your lungs. Accidents would be frequent. Falling rocks, misplaced hammer blows, heat exhaustion. It's a brutal, dangerous environment where human life often seems to be the most expendable commodity. Once the blocks are quarried, They need to be transported. This is where true logistical ingenuity and an incredible amount of human muscle comes into play. If the quarry is near the Nile, the blocks might be levered onto wooden sledges and dragged by teams of men down to the riverbank, perhaps over specially prepared slipways lubricated with water or mud to reduce friction. You can see depictions of this in tombs, scores of men hauling ropes, an overseer clapping out a rhythm or pouring water in front of the sledge. It's a testament to coordinated effort. The blocks are then loaded onto massive barges to be floated downriver to the construction site. If you're unlucky enough to be on sledge hauling duty, your muscles will scream, your hands will be raw from the ropes, and the sheer dead weight of the stone will feel like it's crushing your spirit. If you're assigned to the construction site itself, perhaps the Giza Plateau during the Old Kingdom, or the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom, your work will be equally arduous. You might be part of a team dragging those same massive stone blocks up enormous earthen ramps to their final position in the pyramid or temple wall. Or you could be a labourer mixing mortar, carrying water, or shaping smaller casing stones. The scale of these projects is almost unimaginable. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, is estimated to contain around 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing several tons, all quarried, transported, and put in place with astonishing precision, without the aid of modern cranes or machinery. This precision was crucial, as the smooth angled faces of pyramids or the massive close-fitting blocks of temple walls attest. You'll live in a temporary workers' village near the site, a sprawling camp of basic huts, not unlike your own back home, but perhaps even more crowded and squalid. The organisation of these labour forces was actually quite sophisticated. Workers were often divided into gangs or files, with names like Vigorous Gang or Enduring Gang, which fostered a sense of competition and camaraderie. Skilled artisans, stonemasons, sculptors, painters also worked on these projects, and their conditions might have been slightly better, but for the mass of unskilled labourers like yourself, it's a life of relentless, repetitive toil. Remember the bread and beer diet? It's very much in evidence here, the fuel for this massive human engine. Medical care, such as it was, remember the lizard blood and fly dung, would be available for injuries, because a disabled worker is a useless worker, but prevention wasn't a high priority. One slightly quirky, or perhaps just deeply sobering, discovery at Giza was the lost city of the pyramid builders, a settlement that housed the thousands of workers who built the pyramids of Khafra and Menkaure. Excavations there revealed not just dwellings, but also bakeries, breweries, and even a cemetery with tombs of workers. Analysis of the skeletal remains from this cemetery showed evidence of hard labour, arthritis, spinal injuries, and broken bones that had healed. These were not slaves in the traditional sense, but conscripted Egyptian citizens, fed and housed by the state, who toiled and often died in service to their god-king. This confirmed the mainstream historical fact that the Great Pyramids were built by paid, in rations, Egyptian labourers, not by enslaved foreigners as popularly and biblically depicted. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to lift and place the heavier stone blocks to great heights on structures like the pyramids. Were they long, straight ramps, or zigzagging ramps, or perhaps internal ramps within the pyramid structure itself? Or did they use sophisticated levering techniques? The debates continue, but for you, on the ground, covered in dust and hauling a rope that bites into your shoulder, the precise engineering theory is less important than the immediate crushing reality of the weight you're trying to move. You're a tiny cog in a colossal machine, building a monument for eternity, a testament to a pharaoh's power and his journey to the afterlife. You will never see its gilded capstone, never marvel at the intricate hieroglyphs within its hidden chambers. Your contribution is your sweat, your aching muscles, and perhaps, ultimately, your bones buried in the desert sand nearby. This is your part in creating the wonders of ancient Egypt, and it's a far cry from the glossy tourist brochures. As you toil away, whether in the fields under the blazing sun, or hauling stones for some colossal monument, another, more subtle but equally profound division in ancient Egyptian society becomes starkly apparent. The vast chasm between the literate and the illiterate. You, like the overwhelming majority of your fellow labourers, cannot read or write. The intricate hieroglyphs that adorn temple walls and a scribe's papyrus scroll are, to you, nothing more than mysterious and beautiful, or perhaps intimidating patterns. This lack of literacy isn't just an educational gap. It's a fundamental barrier that defines your status, your opportunities, and your understanding of the world around you. The power of the written word is immense, and it is a power you do not possess. Scribes are a common sight, though they occupy a world entirely different from yours. You might see them in the fields, tallying the harvest, their reed pens flying across sheets of papyrus as they record sacks of grain and bundles of flax. You'll certainly encounter them on state construction projects, meticulously noting down rations, work assignments, and inventories of tools and materials. They're easily recognisable, often seated cross-legged, a palette of inks at their side, a roll of papyrus on their lap. They might wear slightly finer linen, and they carry an air of authority, of access to a knowledge that is closed off to you. They are the record keepers, the administrators, the communicators of the state's will. In a society without widespread mechanical printing, every official document, every religious text, every private letter, every legal contract had to be painstakingly written by hand. The Egyptian writing system itself is a marvel of complexity and beauty. Hieroglyphs, the famous sacred carvings, often found on monumental architecture, are a combination of logographic, representing whole words, syllabic, representing syllables, and alphabetic, representing individual sounds, signs. There are hundreds of distinct hieroglyphs, and mastering them required years of dedicated study. For more everyday purposes, like administrative records or personal letters, scribes used a cursive script called hieratic, which was essentially a simplified, faster version of hieroglyphs, written with a reed pen and ink on papyrus or ostraca, shards of pottery or limestone used as a kind of ancient notepad. Later still, an even more cursive script called demotic developed. But regardless of the script, the skill of writing was a specialised one, jealously guarded and highly valued. Becoming a scribe was one of the few avenues for social advancement available to a common Egyptian boy. Girls were rarely taught to write, though some elite women were literate. If a family could afford it, and if their son showed aptitude, he might be sent to a scribal school, often attached to a temple or a government department. There, he would endure a rigorous education, spending years copying texts, memorizing signs, learning mathematics, and practicing calligraphy. Discipline was strict. A famous ancient Egyptian text known as the Satire of the Trades extols the virtues of being a scribe compared to other, more physically demanding professions, but it also contains the charming line, "A boy's ear is on his back, he listens when he is beaten." So, no spared rods in scribal school apparently. The rewards for this arduous training, however, were significant. Scribes were exempt from manual labour, a huge advantage in a society built on physical toil. They had access to positions in the temple administration, the government bureaucracy, the military, or in the households of wealthy nobles. They could become record keepers, accountants, tax collectors, legal clerks, personal secretaries, or even authors and poets. Literacy opened doors that were firmly shut to people like you. Scribes were the gatekeepers of information, the memory of the state, and the facilitators of its complex operations. One particularly quirky job for some scribes was the letter writer for the illiterate. If you needed to send a message or draw up a simple contract, you'd have to find a scribe, dictate your message, and pay them to write it down for you. This, of course, meant sharing your private affairs with a third party and hoping they accurately conveyed your intentions. This division between the literate elite and the illiterate masses had profound implications. Laws were written down, but you couldn't read them. Religious texts contained the secrets of the gods and the afterlife, but they were inaccessible to you without a priestly intermediary. Government decrees and tax assessments were issued in writing, and you had to rely on others to tell you what they said. Your understanding of history, of the wider world, of complex ideas was limited to what you heard through oral tradition, through stories, songs, and pronouncements from those who could read. You are living in a world rich with recorded knowledge, but you are locked out of it. You might occasionally handle objects with writing on them. Perhaps a pottery jar with a hieratic label indicating its contents or owner, or a stone boundary marker with a few hieroglyphs. To you, they are just marks, but to a scribe they convey precise information. This information gap reinforces the social hierarchy. Those who can read and write are seen as more intelligent, more capable, more important. They control the flow of information, and by extension, they control power. Historians still argue about the exact literacy rates in ancient Egypt, but estimates generally range from 1% to perhaps 5% of the total population at most periods, and even then, literacy skills would have varied greatly. Full mastery of complex hieroglyphic texts was likely confined to a very small, highly educated elite. The scribe's tools, the palette with its cakes of black and red ink, black for general text, red for headings or important points, the reed pens, the water pot for mixing ink, and the burnisher for smoothing papyrus, are symbols of his status and skill. You might watch a scribe at work with a mixture of awe and perhaps a touch of resentment. His hands, uncalloused from manual labour, move with a practised grace, bringing forth meaning from simple marks. Your hands, rough and stained from toil, can only perform the tasks assigned to you. The chasm between your world and his is not just one of education, it's a chasm of opportunity, of influence, of understanding. In ancient Egypt, the pen is truly mightier than the hoe, and you are definitely on the hoe side of that equation. Amidst the daily grind of labour, the ever-present demands of the gods, and the vast social divides, there is one sphere of your ancient Egyptian life that holds the potential for genuine connection, and perhaps even joy, family. However, like so much else in this unforgiving world, family life is tinged with fragility and sorrow. Relationships are precious, but lives are often tragically short, marked by high rates of infant and child mortality, and a life expectancy that would be shocking by modern standards. Your family unit, the bedrock of your social existence, is a source of both profound comfort and potential heartbreak. Marriage in ancient Egypt, at least for commoners like yourself, was generally a relatively informal affair. There wasn't necessarily a big religious ceremony or complex legal contract, especially for your first marriage. It often involved simply setting up a household together, the woman moving into the man's or his family's home. Affection and companionship were valued, as indicated by romantic poetry and depictions of married couples showing affection in art. The ideal was a harmonious household where husband and wife supported each other. Men were generally considered the head of the household, responsible for providing for the family, while women managed the domestic sphere, raising children, preparing food, making clothes, and managing household supplies. However, Egyptian women enjoyed a relatively high status compared to their counterparts in many other ancient societies. They could own property, inherit land, enter into contracts, and even initiate divorce. So, while it was a patriarchal society, it wasn't entirely one-sided. Children were highly desired. They were seen as a blessing from the gods, a source of support in old age, if you lived that long, and essential for continuing the family line and ensuring proper funerary rites after your death. Large families were common, but this was partly a tragic necessity due to the appallingly high rates of infant and child mortality. Many children would not survive their first few years. Diseases that are now easily preventable or treatable, diarrhea, respiratory infections, measles, were often fatal for infants and young children in ancient Egypt. The lack of sanitation, contaminated water, and limited understanding of contagion created a perilous environment for the very young. You would likely experience the grief of losing a child, perhaps multiple children firsthand. It's a sorrow that would be a common thread in the lives of most families around you. Each surviving child would be cherished all the more, but the fear of loss would always linger. Despite the dangers, childhood, for those who survived its initial hurdles, had its moments of play and learning. You'd see children playing with simple toys, wooden animals, balls made of reed or leather, spinning tops, and board games like Senet, which was popular with adults too. They would help with household chores from a young age, learning the skills they would need for their adult lives. Boys would learn their father's trade, whether farming, fishing, or a craft. Girls would learn domestic skills from their mothers. Education, as informal schooling was, as we've seen, reserved for a select few destined for scribal careers. For most, learning was practical and hands-on. The bond between parents and children, and between siblings, would be strong, forged in the shared crucible of daily life and its hardships. Your family is your primary support network. They share your meagre meals, your cramped living space, your small joys, and your many sorrows. In a world without state-sponsored social security or healthcare, your family is your safety net. If you fall ill, they care for you. If you face hardship, they share the burden. This interdependence fosters deep loyalty and a powerful sense of belonging. However, the cycle of life turns quickly. People aged fast under the harsh conditions, A person of 40 would be considered old. Life expectancy for the general population was likely somewhere in the range of 30 to 35 years. This doesn't mean everyone died at 35. Some individuals certainly lived into their 50s, 60s, or even older, as evidenced by skeletal remains. But high infant and child mortality, coupled with the dangers of disease, accidents, and childbirth for women, drag the average down significantly. You would likely see many of your contemporaries sicken and die young. Funerals would be a frequent sombre occurrence. One rather poignant and quirky find from Deir el-Medina, the village of the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, is a collection of letters to the dead. These were messages written on pottery bowls or papyrus, addressed to deceased relatives, asking for their help from the afterlife, or sometimes complaining about problems the living believed the dead were causing. It shows a continued active relationship with deceased family members. The relatively short lifespans meant that generations turned over rapidly. You might become a grandparent at a young age if you survived long enough. The elderly, if they had surviving children, were generally respected and cared for within the family. They were valued for their wisdom and experience. However, old age without family support would be a grim prospect. Historians still argue about the emotional landscape of ancient Egyptian family life. Did the high mortality rates lead to a degree of emotional detachment, a way of coping with frequent loss? Or did it make familial bonds even more precious and intensely felt? The surviving art and literature suggest a deep capacity for love, affection, and grief. Tomb paintings often depict families in idealized scenes of harmony and togetherness, expressing a wish for these bonds to continue into the afterlife. The loss of a spouse or a child was clearly a source of profound sorrow. Your family, then, is your anchor in this ancient world. They are the faces you see at the beginning and end of each exhausting day, the hands that help you, the voices that comfort you. But this anchor is constantly threatened by the storms of disease and early death. You love fiercely because life is fleeting. You celebrate new births with joy, but always with an underlying prayer for survival. Brief lives, early graves. This is the rhythm of family in ancient Egypt, a bittersweet melody of love and loss played out against a backdrop of unyielding hardship. After the relentless toil in the fields or on the construction site, and with the constant anxieties about health, sustenance, and divine displeasure, you might wonder if there's any room at all for joy or relaxation in your ancient Egyptian life. The answer is yes, but it's a qualified yes. Leisure time, as you understand it, weekends off, paid vacations, binge-watching your favourite series, is a concept that simply doesn't exist for the vast majority of people here. However, human beings, even under the most arduous conditions, find ways to connect, to play, and to momentarily escape the burdens of their existence. Your moments of relief will be simple, often communal, and deeply cherished for their rarity. For most of your waking hours, you're working. There's always something that needs doing: tending the crops, mending tools, fetching water, preparing food, caring for children. But there are lulls. The cool of the evening after the sun has set and the main work of the day is done might offer a brief window for some respite. Perhaps during certain religious festivals, work might be suspended for a day or two, allowing for communal celebration. These are the moments you live for, the small oases in a desert of labour. What do you do with this precious, limited free time? Entertainment isn't something you consume passively from a screen. It's something you actively participate in creating. Storytelling would be a hugely important form of leisure. In a largely illiterate society, oral traditions are strong. Gathered around a smoky fire in your hut, or in a communal village space, you might listen to elders recount ancient myths, legends of the gods and heroes, tales of cunning animals, or perhaps just local gossip and news. These stories entertain, they educate, they reinforce social norms, and they connect you to your cultural heritage. A skilled storyteller would be a prized member of any community, capable of transporting listeners to other worlds, even if just for a little while. Music and dance would also play a significant role in both religious ceremonies and more informal gatherings. You might hear the rhythmic beat of a drum, the plaintive notes of a reed flute, or the strumming of a simple harp or lyre. People would clap, sing, and dance. Egyptian art depicts various musical instruments: harps of different sizes, lutes, lyres, flutes, clarinets of a sort, trumpets, and various percussion instruments like drums, tambourines, and sistra, a type of rattle particularly associated with the goddess Hathor. While professional musicians and dancers performed for the elite and in temple rituals, music making would also be a part of everyday village life. A simple song sung while working, or a more lively tune for dancing in the evening, could lift spirits and foster a sense of community. You might not be a virtuoso, but you could join in the singing or clapping, feeling a part of something larger than yourself. Games were another popular pastime for both children and adults. We've mentioned Senet, a board game played on a rectangular board with 30 squares, which was incredibly popular throughout Egyptian history, found in tombs from the earliest dynasties to the Roman period. The rules are not perfectly understood, but it seems to have been a game of strategy and luck, perhaps with symbolic connections to the journey to the afterlife. You might play Senet with a neighbour, using pebbles or small carved pieces on a board scratched into the dirt or a piece of wood. Another common game was Hounds and Jackals, a race game with pieces shaped like animal heads. Children, as we noted, had their simpler toys, but they also engaged in timeless childhood games, running, wrestling, playing tag, and various forms of make-believe. These moments of play are a universal human need, a way to develop skills, burn off energy, and simply have fun. Hunting and fishing, while often a means of supplementing the diet, could also have a recreational aspect, at least for those with the time and opportunity. For commoners, any hunting would likely be for small game: birds, hares, using nets, traps, or throwing sticks. A curved throwing stick, similar to a boomerang, was a common hunting tool. Fishing with a simple line and hook in a nearby canal could be a quiet, contemplative activity, a brief escape from more strenuous labours. One rather quirky form of entertainment, or perhaps more accurately a social gathering, was the beer house or local tavern. While your daily beer ration is more like liquid bread, establishments did exist where stronger, perhaps more palatable beer was served. These could be places for socialising, for sharing news, and for escaping the confines of a crowded hut. However, they could also be seen as places of potential disorder. Some ancient Egyptian wisdom texts warn against spending too much time in beer houses, lest you neglect your duties or fall into bad company. So, a pint down at the local, ancient pub might be a rare treat, but probably not an everyday occurrence if you want to keep your job and your reputation intact. Religious festivals provided some of the most significant breaks from the routine. These were not just solemn religious observances, but also occasions for feasting, drinking, music, dancing, and public spectacle. The beautiful Feast of the Valley, for example, was a major Theban festival where the cult statue of Amun-Ra from Karnak Temple was taken in a grand procession across the Nile to visit the mortuary temples on the West Bank. Families would feast and make offerings to their deceased relatives in their tombs. These festivals were a vital part of the social and religious calendar, a time when the entire community came together, reinforcing social bonds and providing a much-needed release from the everyday. Historians still argue about the precise balance between the sacred and secular aspects of these festivals. Were they primarily religious events with some social enjoyment, or social events with a religious justification? For you, experiencing the music, the food, and the break from work, the distinction might not matter much. It's a party, and you're grateful for it. These simple joys, a shared story, a song, a game of Senet, a festival day, are the bright threads in the otherwise coarse fabric of your daily life. They are not grand or luxurious, but they are essential. They remind you of your connection to others, of your shared humanity, and they provide the strength to face another day of toil in the land of the pharaohs. While you're busy worrying about your aching back, your meagre rations, and the mood of the local gods, it's easy to forget that you share your ancient Egyptian world with a host of other inhabitants, many of them far less concerned with social niceties or divine appeasement. Your immediate environment, from the fertile fields along the Nile to the dusty corners of your mud hut, is teeming with creatures, and not all of them are as picturesque as the ibis, or as noble as the falcon. We're talking about the creepy crawlies, the things that slither and bite, the creatures that can make your life uncomfortable, painful, or even abruptly short. Forget a gentle nature documentary. This is an immersive and sometimes alarming wildlife experience. Let's start with the small but mighty. Scorpions are a ubiquitous presence in arid environments, and ancient Egypt is no exception. Several species scuttle through the desert sands, hide under rocks, and, disconcertingly, can find their way into your home, seeking shelter from the heat or pursuing insect prey. A scorpion sting is intensely painful, and, depending on the species and the health of the victim, children and the elderly being most vulnerable, can be fatal. You'll learn quickly to shake out your reed mat before lying down and to be cautious when reaching into dark corners or disturbing piles of wood or debris. The goddess Serket, often depicted as a woman with a scorpion on her head, was invoked for protection against stings and to help heal those who were stung. You might even wear an amulet bearing her image, hoping it provides some prophylactic power. It's a small comfort when you hear that telltale rustle in the thatch roof above your head. Snakes are another common concern. Egypt is home to a variety of snakes, from harmless grass snakes to highly venomous cobras and vipers. The Egyptian cobra, with its iconic hood, is particularly famous, and its bite can be deadly. You might encounter snakes in the fields, basking in the sun, or even slithering into your grain storage in search of rodents. Again, caution is your best defense. Some magical spells and amulets were designed to protect against snake bites, and certain deities like Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, or the aforementioned Renenutet, harvest goddess, also a cobra, had serpentine forms, indicating a complex relationship of fear and reverence. There were even snake charmers, though whether they were truly charming the snakes or just skilled at handling them without getting bitten is a matter of some debate. One fringe theory you might hear whispered is that certain temple priests knew secret techniques to render snakes temporarily harmless for ritual purposes, perhaps by cooling them down or applying specific herbal concoctions. You probably don't want to test that theory yourself. Moving up in size, let's not forget the Nile's most infamous residents, crocodiles and hippopotamuses. We've touched on them before, but their presence is a constant factor if you live or work near the river. A Nile crocodile lurking just beneath the surface or camouflaged on a muddy bank is an apex predator. Attacks on humans and livestock were a grim reality. You'd be foolish to dangle your feet in the water or to venture too close to reed beds where they might be nesting. The god Sobek, depicted with the head of a crocodile, was worshipped as a deity of fertility, military prowess and protection, particularly in areas where crocodiles were prevalent like the Fayum. It's a classic case of appeasing a powerful and dangerous force. Hippos, as mentioned, are surprisingly aggressive and territorial. Their massive jaws and sharp tusks can crush a small boat or inflict horrific injuries. They might also raid crops near the riverbank, adding agricultural pests to their list of undesirable traits. Staying well clear of these river giants is simply common sense. Then there are the insects. Oh, the glorious swarming, biting, buzzing insects. Flies are everywhere, attracted by food, waste and warm bodies. They are not just an annoyance, they are significant vectors for disease, landing on filth and then on your food or your eyes. Mosquitoes, breeding in stagnant water along the Nile and in irrigation canals, are a constant torment, especially at dusk and dawn, and they carry their own array of diseases including malaria, though the prevalence of malaria in ancient Egypt is still a subject of scholarly research and debate. Fleas and lice would be common companions in your crowded living conditions, making for itchy nights and days. Locusts, though not a daily threat, could arrive in devastating swarms, stripping fields bare and leading to famine. An ancient Egyptian hymn to the Nile actually praises the river for, among other things, keeping the locusts away, or at least mitigating their impact by ensuring agricultural bounty. Even seemingly innocuous creatures could pose problems. Rodents, rats and mice, would be attracted to stored grain in your hut or in communal granaries. They consume food, spoil it with their droppings, and can also carry diseases. Cats, of course, were domesticated and highly valued in ancient Egypt, partly for their ability to control rodent populations, and also revered as manifestations of goddesses like Bastet. So having a cat around your dwelling would be a definite plus, your own little furry pest control operative. Dogs were also common, used for hunting, guarding and companionship, but feral or stray dogs could also be a nuisance or even a danger. The desert areas bordering the fertile Nile Valley harboured other creatures you might encounter if your work took you there, or if they ventured into the cultivated lands in search of food or water. Jackals, hyenas and various species of wild cats roam the desert edges. While direct attacks on humans were probably rare, they could pose a threat to livestock. And let's not forget the less dramatic but still irritating encounters: biting ants, various beetles, some of which, like the scarab, were revered, while others were just pests, and perhaps the occasional large hairy spider that makes you jump. Historians still argue about the extent to which ancient Egyptians actively managed or attempted to control problematic wildlife populations, beyond individual protective measures or localized pest control, like your friendly household cat. Were there organized efforts to, say, cull crocodile numbers in heavily populated areas, or was it largely a matter of coexist and beware? Given the reverence for many animal-form deities, a large-scale extermination campaign seems unlikely, but specific problem animals might have been dealt with. For you, though, it's less about grand ecological strategy and more about the immediate need to not get bitten, stung, or eaten. Your world is shared, and your cohabitants are not always friendly. Each step outside, each reach into a dark space, carries a small frisson of risk from the natural world, a world that is very much red in tooth and claw, or perhaps stinger and fang. Beyond the immediate physical dangers posed by crocodiles in the Nile or scorpions in your sandals, there's another, more pervasive sense of us versus them that colours your existence in ancient Egypt. This isn't just about the natural world, it extends to other human beings. Ancient Egyptian society, while capable of incorporating foreigners, particularly during periods of empire and extensive trade, possessed a strong core identity and often viewed outsiders with a mixture of suspicion, disdain, and sometimes outright hostility. You, as an unexpected, out-of-place arrival, are definitely one of them, and navigating this cultural landscape requires a keen awareness of your foreignness. The Egyptians had a powerful sense of their own unique cultural and cosmic order, centered around the concept of Ma'at. Their land, Kemet, the Black Land, nourished by the Nile's dark silt, was seen as divinely ordered realm, a bastion of civilization surrounded by Deshret, the red land of the chaotic desert, and by foreign lands inhabited by, in their view, less civilized peoples. This worldview is starkly represented in art, where the pharaoh is often depicted smiting foreign enemies, symbolizing the triumph of order over chaos. Foreigners were frequently portrayed with stereotypical features and attire, often in subservient or defeated postures. This isn't to say all interactions were hostile, but the underlying ideology emphasized Egyptian superiority. The term Egyptians used for themselves was T, Remet Gen Kemet, people of the Black Land. Everyone else fell into broader categories. Peoples to the south, in Nubia, were often referred to as Nehesu. Peoples to the west, the Libyans, were Jehenu or Jemhu. Peoples to the east, from the Levant and beyond, were generally termed Amu, Asiatics. These weren't neutral ethnographic labels. They often carried connotations of otherness, and sometimes inferiority. You, with your strange to them appearance, your incomprehensible language, and your utter lack of understanding of local customs, would immediately be marked as an outsider, a kiyati, foreigner. Your language, or rather your lack of theirs, is an immediate and significant barrier. The Egyptian language, a member of the Afroasiatic language family, is complex. Even if you manage to pick up a few basic phrases for bread or water, conducting any meaningful conversation, understanding instructions, or heaven forbid, trying to plead your case if you get into trouble, would be nearly impossible. You're reliant on gestures, on the patience or impatience of those around you, and on finding someone, anyone, who might have a smattering of a language you know, highly unlikely in your current circumstances. This inability to communicate effectively isolates you and makes you vulnerable. Misunderstandings are inevitable and can have serious consequences. Your appearance also sets you apart. Your skin tone, your hair colour and texture, your facial features might be different from the local population. Your clothes, assuming you arrived in anything remotely modern, would be bizarre and impractical. Even if you adopt local linen garments, you might still stand out. This visible difference can attract unwanted attention, suspicion, or even ridicule. Children might point and stare. Adults might eye you warily. You're a curiosity, an anomaly, and in a society that values order and conformity, anomalies can be unsettling. Customs and etiquette are another minefield. Simple things like how to greet someone, how to accept food or drink, what topics are acceptable for conversation, what gestures are considered polite or rude. You know none of this. You are constantly at risk of causing offence unintentionally. For example, showing the soles of your feet might be considered disrespectful. Certain ways of addressing people of different social statuses are expected. Religious practices and taboos, as we've seen, are numerous and complex. You could easily blunder into a sacred space, or mishandle an object considered sacred, or say or do something that is deeply offensive to local religious sensibilities, all out of sheer ignorance. The consequences for such blunders could range from social ostracism to more severe punishment if a powerful priest or official takes offence. While Egypt did engage in trade and diplomacy with foreign lands, and even incorporated foreign mercenaries into its army, or foreign artisans into its workshops, these interactions were often on Egyptian terms, within a framework that maintained Egyptian dominance. Foreigners living in Egypt, even those who were there for legitimate reasons like trade, often resided in specific quarters or communities. Assimilation was possible, over generations, but for a newcomer like you, acceptance would be hard-won, if it came at all. One quirky historical tidbit is the presence of execration texts. These were pottery vessels or figurines inscribed with the names of enemies of Egypt, foreign rulers, troublesome tribes, or even internal rebels, which were then ritually smashed or buried, magically neutralizing their power. It's a vivid illustration of the us versus them mentality taken to a ritualistic extreme. You might find that people are reluctant to help you, to share resources with you, or to trust you. You are an unknown quantity, without the local family or community ties that define a person's place in society. You have no references, no one to vouch for you. In a world where resources are scarce and trust is earned, you start with a significant deficit. Xenophobia, the fear or dislike of foreigners, is not a modern invention. It was a palpable force in the ancient world, and you are now experiencing it from the sharp end. Historians still argue about the degree of cultural openness versus insularity in ancient Egypt across its long history. Periods of strong centralized rule and imperial expansion, like the New Kingdom, likely saw more interaction with and absorption of foreign elements than more isolationist periods. However, the core Egyptian cultural identity remained remarkably resilient and distinct. For you, the immediate challenge is not to analyze these long-term historical trends, but to survive the daily reality of being an outsider. You must be observant, cautious, and adaptable, trying to learn the unwritten rules of this society as quickly as possible simply to avoid trouble. Your difference is your most defining characteristic right now, and in ancient Egypt being different often meant being suspect. Just when you think you've settled into the grueling rhythm of agricultural labour or monumental construction, a new, far more terrifying prospect looms, especially if you are a young, able-bodied male: military conscription. The pharaohs of Egypt, particularly during expansive periods like the New Kingdom, maintained large and formidable armies to defend their borders, control trade routes, and project their power into neighbouring lands like Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. And these armies needed a constant supply of recruits. While there was a core of professional soldiers and elite chariot corps, mass infantry levies drawn from the general, peasant population, like yourself, formed the backbone of Egypt's military might. The call to arms is not a request, it's a command, and the reality of ancient warfare is a brutal, bloody, and terrifying business. The summons would arrive in your village unceremoniously. A recruiting officer, perhaps accompanied by a few tough-looking soldiers, would appear, his presence casting a pall over the community. Quotas would be set for each district, and local officials would be responsible for selecting the required number of men. There might be some rudimentary assessment of fitness, but generally, if you looked capable of marching and holding a spear, you were eligible. There's no conscientious objector status here, no deferment for being the sole provider for your family. The needs of the state and the pharaoh's ambitions come first. Saying goodbye to your family, your meagre possessions, and the familiar routines of your village, you would be marched off, along with other reluctant recruits, to a training camp or directly to join a larger army on the move. Training, such as it was for conscripts, would be focused on basic discipline, marching in formation, and proficiency with simple weapons. You wouldn't be transformed into an elite warrior overnight. You'd likely be armed with a spear, a simple axe or mace, and perhaps a shield made of cowhide stretched over a wooden frame. Body armour like leather jerkins or scale armour was generally reserved for more professional soldiers or officers. You, in your basic linen kilt, would be alarmingly exposed. Archery was a key component of the Egyptian army, and some recruits would be trained as archers, but spear and shield infantry formed the bulk of the fighting force. You'd practice drills, learn basic battlefield maneuvers, and try to overcome your natural aversion to charging at other men who are trying to kill you. It's a crash course in organised violence, and the final exam is terrifyingly real. Ancient battles were not the stylised, almost balletic affairs sometimes depicted in movies. They were chaotic, visceral, and incredibly brutal. Imagine standing in a packed formation, shoulder to shoulder with other nervous, sweating men, your heart pounding in your chest. Across a dusty plain, you see the enemy army, perhaps Nubian archers, Libyan spearmen, or Hittite chariots, their shouts and war cries mixing with your own. The air is thick with tension. Then the signal is given, a blare of trumpets, a beating of drums, and you advance, often at a run, into a hail of arrows and sling stones. The noise is overwhelming, the clang of weapons, the screams of the wounded, the thud of bodies falling. Close quarters combat is a terrifying scrum. You're jabbing with your spear, trying to find a gap in an enemy's shield, while desperately protecting yourself. The fighting is face to face, personal, and utterly exhausting. Dust chokes you, sweat stings your eyes. Men around you fall, crying out in pain or abruptly silenced. The smell of blood and fear is everywhere. There's little room for finesse. It's about brute force, aggression, and a desperate will to survive. If your line breaks, it becomes a rout, a panicked flight where men are cut down from behind. If you stand firm, the killing continues until one side gains the advantage. Remember those graphic depictions of smiting enemies on temple walls? You're now a participant in creating the raw material for such scenes. The Egyptian army was renowned for its discipline and organisation, particularly its chariot corps, which acted as mobile missile platforms and shock troops. But for an infantryman like yourself, life in the pharaoh's army is harsh. Campaigns could last for months, taking you far from home into unfamiliar and hostile territory. Rations might be irregular, disease could sweep through the camps, and the discipline enforced by officers, often with the use of a rod, would be strict. The spoils of war, plunder, captives, were a powerful motivator, but these were often monopolised by officers and elite units. For you, survival is the primary goal. One rather grim but quirky aspect of Egyptian military practice was the counting of enemy dead by severing and collecting their hands, or, in some depictions, their phalluses. These grisly trophies were then presented to scribes for tallying, as proof of a soldier's prowess, and as a way of calculating the enemy's losses. It's a stark reminder of the dehumanising nature of warfare. You might be encouraged, or even ordered, to participate in such practices. It's a long way from your peaceful, if toilsome, life-hoeing onions by the Nile. If you are captured by the enemy, your fate is grim. You might be executed on the spot, enslaved, or subjected to brutal treatment. There are no Geneva Conventions here. Similarly, enemy captives taken by the Egyptian army faced a bleak future, often ending up as slaves working on state projects or in the households of the elite. War in the ancient world was a total and unforgiving enterprise. Historians still argue about the motivations of the common Egyptian soldier. Was it patriotic fervour, loyalty to the pharaoh, the lure of plunder, or simply the fear of punishment for desertion? It was likely a combination of all these factors. For you, caught up in the maelstrom of battle, abstract concepts like patriotism probably take a back seat to the immediate visceral need to stay alive and protect the men fighting beside you. The bonds forged with your fellow soldiers in the crucible of combat would be incredibly strong, a brotherhood born of shared terror and mutual reliance. Surviving a battle, let alone an entire campaign, is a matter of skill, luck, and the gods' favour. If you do make it back to your village, you will be changed. You will have seen and done things that are hard to forget. You might bear physical scars, and you will certainly carry the invisible wounds of your experience. The call to serve in the pharaoh's army is a call to face the rawest, most brutal aspects of human existence, a stark contrast to the idealised order of Ma'at that Egyptian ideology proclaimed. Your life was already hard. Military service just adds a terrifying new dimension of peril. Even if you manage to avoid the pointy end of an enemy spear or the crushing weight of a falling pyramid block, your health in ancient Egypt remains a constant nagging concern. We've touched upon some of the prevalent diseases and the rather alarming cures, but the sheer range of ailments that could afflict you is worth exploring further. Your body is a veritable playground for parasites, bacteria, and viruses, and the ancient Egyptian understanding of what causes these afflictions and how to effectively treat them is often a bewildering mix of astute observation and profound magical misapplication. You're living in a world where a minor infection can become a death sentence, and where many chronic conditions simply have to be endured. Eye problems, as mentioned, were rampant. The combination of desert dust, smoke from cooking fires, swarms of flies, and intense sunlight created a perfect storm for ocular infections. Trachoma, leading to scarring of the cornea and eventual blindness, was endemic. Cataracts also likely afflicted the elderly. Conjunctivitis, or pink eye, would be a common and miserable experience. Medical papyri list numerous remedies for eye ailments, often involving ingredients like honey, which has some antibacterial properties, human milk, various minerals, like kohl, which, while potentially toxic, might have had some fly repellent or mild antiseptic effect due to the lead or antimony compounds, and, of course, magical incantations. You might see people applying poultices to their eyes, or reciting spells to ward off the demons believed to cause blindness. Good luck with that when you can barely see your hand in front of your face. Digestive troubles were another daily reality. Remember that gritty bread slowly wearing down your teeth? It also did a number on your digestive system. Add to that the potential for contaminated water and food, and it's no surprise that dysentery, diarrhea, and various stomach ailments were frequent visitors. These could lead to severe dehydration, especially dangerous for children and the elderly. Treatments often involved purgatives to expel the sickness, or astringent substances to try and stop diarrhea. Again, magical formulas and amulets would be employed alongside these physical remedies. You might be advised to ingest a concoction of figs, dates, and donkey dung to cure your stomach cramps. It's a tough choice, the cramps or the cure. Parasitic infections were, as we've noted, virtually unavoidable. Schistosomiasis, contracted from wading in Nile water, caused chronic inflammation, blood in the urine, a symptom so common it was sometimes just accepted as normal, and long-term damage to internal organs. Intestinal worms like Ascaris, roundworm, and Trichuris, whipworm, contracted from contaminated soil or food, would sap your energy and nutrients. Guinea worm disease, acquired by drinking water contaminated with copepods carrying the worm larvae, was particularly horrific. The adult female worm, up to a metre long, would eventually emerge slowly and painfully from a blister on the skin, usually on the legs or feet. The only treatment was to carefully wind the emerging worm around a small stick, a few centimetres each day, a process that could take weeks and was prone to infection. One quirky, though horrifying detail is that if the worm broke during extraction, it could cause severe inflammation and even death. You'd be praying to whatever god specialised in worm extraction for a steady hand. Respiratory illnesses, like bronchitis and pneumonia, would also be common, especially in the cooler winter months or in smoky, poorly ventilated huts. The dust from agricultural work or construction would also take its toll on your lungs over time. Treatments might involve inhaling, steam from boiled herbs, or, again, applying poultices and reciting spells. Tuberculosis has also been identified in Egyptian mummies, indicating its presence in the population. Skin ailments, from fungal infections and rashes to infected wounds and boils, would be a constant nuisance. The hot climate, combined with limited hygiene and the prevalence of biting insects, made your skin vulnerable. Minor cuts or abrasions, easily ignored today, could quickly become dangerously infected in this pre-antibiotic era. Poultices made from honey, grease, and various plant materials were common treatments for wounds, some of which might have had genuine, if limited, antiseptic or healing properties. But for a serious infection, your chances weren't great. Beyond these infectious diseases, people also suffered from chronic conditions. Arthritis, exacerbated by a lifetime of hard physical labour, is frequently seen in skeletal remains. Dental abscesses, as discussed, could lead to systemic infections. Evidence of conditions like gout, and even some forms of cancer, has been found in mummies, though diagnosis in ancient times would have been impossible. For many chronic pains and debilitating conditions, there was little to be done beyond trying to manage the symptoms with herbal remedies or appealing to the gods for relief. Historians still argue about the efficacy of many ancient Egyptian medical treatments. how much was genuinely beneficial due to empirical observation of plant properties, and how much was pure placebo effect bolstered by magical ritual. The Ebers Papyrus, for instance, lists over 700 magical formulas and remedies. While some ingredients, like willow bark, a source of salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, might have had real effects, others seem purely symbolic or even counterproductive. The understanding of disease causation was fundamentally different. Illness was often attributed to the actions of angry gods, malevolent spirits, or disturbances in the body's internal balance, a concept similar to the later Greek humoral theory. Therefore, treatments aimed not just to address physical symptoms, but also to appease the offended deity or expel the invading spirit through incantations, amulets, and purification rituals. The Sueologist doctor often worked closely with priests or magicians. You might consult a scorpion charmer who specialized in treating stings through a combination of practical first aid and magical spells, or a priest of Sekhmet to intercede with the lioness goddess if you were suffering from a fever. Your path to healing is as much a spiritual quest as a medical one, and the line between the two is very, very blurry. Your survival often depends on a robust immune system, a good deal of luck, and perhaps a well-placed amulet or two. Modern medicine has never looked so good. After a life filled with unceasing toil, meagre sustenance, constant health threats, and the ever-present demands of gods and pharaohs, you might hope for a glorious send-off, a journey to the afterlife in a gilded sarcophagus, your body carefully preserved for eternity, like the mummies you've seen in museums. Well, it's time for another reality check. The elaborate mummification rituals, the richly decorated tombs, and the vast assemblages of funerary goods that so define our popular image of ancient Egypt were almost exclusively the preserve of royalty, nobles, and very high-ranking officials. For an ordinary peasant like yourself, your final arrangements will be far simpler, far hastier, and far less likely to ensure your comfortable passage to the field of reeds. Forget paradise. You're heading for a pit grave. When your brief and arduous life finally draws to a close, perhaps you succumb to one of those delightful parasitic infections, or a workplace accident, or simply wear out from years of hard labour. Your family will mourn you, certainly, but they will have neither the resources nor the access to the specialised services required for elaborate embalming. The full mummification process, as described by Herodotus and evidenced by royal mummies, was a lengthy and expensive affair taking up to 70 days. It involved removing the internal organs, except usually the heart, considered the seat of intellect and emotion, drying out the body with natron, that useful salt mixture again, anointing it with oils and resins, and wrapping it in many layers of linen bandages, often interspersed with amulets and magical spells. This was skilled work, performed by specialized priests and embalmers, and it cost a fortune. You, my friend, are not on that client list. Instead, your burial will likely be a much more rudimentary affair. Your family will wash your body, perhaps anoint it with some oil if they can afford it, and wrap it in a simple linen shroud. Maybe even just the clothes you died in. There will be no ornate coffin carved with your likeness and inscribed with protective spells. At best, you might be placed in a simple wooden box, or perhaps just wrapped in a reed mat. The grieving period will be short. Life and work must go on for the survivors. Your final resting place will not be a grand rock-cut tomb in the Valley of the Kings or a majestic pyramid on the Giza Plateau. You will likely be buried in a common cemetery, often located on the edge of the desert, away from the precious fertile land needed for agriculture. The grave itself will be a simple pit dug into the sand. Your body might be placed in a contracted or fetal position, perhaps facing west towards the land of the dead. You won't be accompanied by hordes of treasure, no golden masks or jeweled pectorals. Any grave goods will be meagre and reflect your humble status. A few pottery vessels, perhaps containing a small offering of food or beer for your journey to the afterlife. A well-worn tool you used in life. Maybe a single, simple amulet. These are not items of great material value, but they represent the love and hope of your family for your continued existence. The dry desert sand itself would actually have been a surprisingly effective, if unintentional, preservative. Bodies buried directly in the hot, arid sand often desiccated naturally, creating natural mummies without the need for elaborate embalming. In fact, some of the earliest evidence for Egyptian belief in an afterlife comes from these simple pre-dynastic pit graves, where bodies were found remarkably well preserved, often with basic grave goods, So you might end up naturally mummified, just not in the glamorous, bandaged way you imagined. One rather quirky and slightly macabre detail is that these shallow desert graves were also vulnerable to disturbance by scavenging animals like jackals. This may have been one of the driving forces behind the development of more secure burial methods like coffins and tombs at least for those who could afford them. You, however, might just have to take your chances with the local wildlife. The elaborate funerary texts, like the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers intended to help the deceased navigate the perils of the underworld and achieve a blessed afterlife, were generally inscribed on papyrus scrolls placed in the tombs of the wealthy. While the core beliefs about the afterlife were widespread, your access to these magical guidebooks would be limited. You would rely on the basic funerary rites performed by your family and your own good deeds in life, or lack thereof, weighed against the feather of Maat in the judgment hall of Osiris, to see you through. The hope was still there, to be judged worthy and enter the field of reeds, a kind of agricultural paradise where you would live a blissful eternal life. But your journey would be less well-equipped, more perilous than that of your social superiors. Historians still argue about the exact nature and accessibility of afterlife beliefs for the common Egyptian. Did they genuinely expect the same detailed, complex journey through the underworld as depicted in royal tombs? Or was their understanding more generalized, focused on reunion with ancestors and a continuation of an idealized earthly existence? The simplicity of commoner burials might suggest a less elaborate eschatology, or perhaps just a pragmatic acceptance of limited resources. What is clear is that the desire for an afterlife, and the need to be properly buried by one's family, was deeply ingrained across all levels of society. Even a simple pit grave with a few humble offerings represented a profound act of piety and hope. So, as your body is lowered into the sandy earth, under the vast, indifferent Egyptian sky, there are no grand pronouncements, no intricate rituals performed by shaven-headed priests. Just the quiet grief of your family, the shifting sands, and the hope that your Ka and Ba will find their way. Your contribution to the monumental landscape of ancient Egypt was your labour in life. In death, you return to the anonymous dust from which its greatness was built. No golden paradise awaits in your tomb, only the silence of the desert and the faint echo of a life of toil. As you reflect on your experiences in ancient Egypt, the back-breaking labour, the meagre food, the constant threat of disease, the pervasive influence of gods in the state, a rather depressing thought might begin to dawn on you. For all the individual struggles, the small joys, the personal tragedies you witness and endure, the fundamental conditions of life for an ordinary person like yourself change remarkably little over vast stretches of Egyptian history. You're caught in a world of seemingly endless cycles, a society characterized by immense stability, yes, but also by a profound, almost inescapable stagnation for those at the bottom. There is no grand arc of progress for people like you, no real hope of breaking free from the predetermined patterns of existence. Consider the agricultural rhythms that dictate your days. The Nile floods, the land is sown, the crops are harvested. This cycle, established millennia before your arrival, continues with an almost metronomic regularity. The tools you use, the simple plough, the hoe, the sickle, are virtually unchanged for hundreds, even thousands of years. The types of crops grown, the methods of irrigation, the struggle against pests and drought. These are timeless challenges, faced by your ancestors and likely to be faced by your descendants in much the same way. There are no revolutionary agricultural breakthroughs on the horizon that will ease your burden or dramatically increase your yield. The black silt of the Nile is a blessing, but it also locks Egypt into a specific highly successful but ultimately static mode of production. Your housing, the simple mud brick hut, is a design that endures for centuries. While the palaces of pharaohs and the temples of gods might grow in scale and magnificence, the basic dwelling of the commoner remains remarkably consistent. The same smoky interiors, the same packed earth floors, the same vulnerability to the elements and to uninvited creepy crawlies. There's no ancient Egyptian equivalent of a housing boom or an urban renewal project that will dramatically improve your living conditions. You live much as your great-great-grandparents did, and your great-great-grandchildren likely will too. The social structure too is remarkably rigid and enduring. At the top is the divine pharaoh, an absolute monarch. Beneath him are the nobles, the priests, the scribes, the artisans, and then, forming the broad base of the pyramid, the peasant farmers and labourers like yourself. While individuals might occasionally rise or fall in status, a talented scribe from a humble background for instance, or a disgraced noble, the overall structure remains firmly in place. There is no burgeoning middle class demanding political rights, no peasant revolt successfully overturning the established order. Though there were periods of unrest and breakdown of central authority, the fundamental social hierarchy tended to reassert itself. Your place in society is largely determined by your birth, and the opportunities for upward mobility are severely limited. You are born to toil, and toil you shall. The religious beliefs and practices, while evolving over time with the rise and fall in prominence of certain deities or cults, like the brief Athenist heresy of Akhenaten, which was a radical departure but ultimately short-lived, maintain a deep underlying continuity. The core concepts of Ma'at, the divinity of the pharaoh, the importance of funerary rites, the appeasement of a vast pantheon of gods through ritual and offering. These are foundational elements that persist for millennia. The gods your distant ancestors worshipped are, by and large, the same gods you're expected to appease. The magical spells and amulets used for protection have an ancient lineage. There's no great religious reformation or enlightenment movement sweeping through the land, challenging the old ways. The traditions are ancient, and they are powerful. Even the threats to your well-being have a timeless quality. The diseases caused by parasites in the Nile, the eye infections spread by flies, the dangers of childbirth, these are perennial problems. While Egyptian medical knowledge did accumulate some empirical wisdom, as seen in texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the fundamental understanding of disease causation, gods, spirits, imbalances, remained largely unchanged, limiting the development of truly effective systematic healthcare. The remedies your grandmother used are likely the same ones you'll try with similarly mixed results. This sense of unchanging continuity is one of the defining characteristics of ancient Egyptian civilization. It's a source of its incredible resilience and longevity. Egyptian pharaonic culture lasted for over 3,000 years, an astonishing span. But for an individual trapped within that system, particularly at the lower rungs, this stability can feel like a cage. There's a certain fatalism, perhaps, an acceptance that this is how things are, and how they will always be. The grand narratives of history, the rise and fall of dynasties, the construction of monumental temples, these are events that happen to you, or around you, but they don't fundamentally alter the texture of your daily life. You're a subject of history, not an agent of its change. One quirky illustration of this deep conservatism is the persistence of artistic conventions. The way human figures are depicted in Egyptian art, profile face, frontal eye, frontal torso, profile legs, remained remarkably consistent for thousands of years. While there were stylistic evolutions, the core representational rules endured. This wasn't due to a lack of artistic skill, but a deliberate adherence to established forms that were considered correct and imbued with meaning. It's a visual metaphor for the broader cultural inertia. Historians still argue whether this perception of stagnation is entirely fair, or if it overlooks subtle but significant long-term changes in social organisation, economic practices, or religious expression. There were certainly periods of innovation and flux. However, from the perspective of an ordinary individual living day to day, the overwhelming impression is one of continuity, of life lived within well-worn grooves. There is no sudden technological revolution, no radical social upheaval, no new philosophical framework that promises to transform your world or offer an escape from the endless cycles of labour and hardship. Your life is a single, fleeting note in a vast, ancient and largely unchanging symphony. And the symphony plays on, indifferent to your small, personal struggles. And so, your time in ancient Egypt, this unexpected and rather bruising journey through a world so different from your own, begins to draw towards a close. Not in a dramatic fashion, no sudden portal back to your familiar comforts, but in the slow, inexorable way that all lives, in all times, eventually fade. Your body, weathered by years of toil under the Egyptian sun, weakened by meagre diets and the constant assault of disease, begins to fail. The vibrant, overwhelming sensory experiences of your arrival, the cacophony of Theban streets, The shimmering heat haze, the pungent smells, have long since become the mundane backdrop of your existence. You have, in your own way, adapted, survived, perhaps even found fleeting moments of joy and connection. But the relentless cycles of this ancient land are ultimately indifferent to your individual fate. As your strength wanes, you become more reliant on your family if they are still with you. Your children, now grown, perhaps with children of their own, tend to your needs as best they can, just as you once tended to theirs. The community, which once viewed you as a strange outsider, may now see you as just another aging soul, nearing the end of a hard life, no different from countless others who have lived and died by the Nile. The grand monuments of the pharaohs, the pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues, still stand, timeless and imposing, a stark contrast to the transience of your own small existence. You were never a part of that monumental story, only a tiny, unnamed labourer in its shadow. Your mind might drift back, not to the world you were snatched from, that memory perhaps is mercifully blurred, a dream too distant to grasp, but to the small moments of your Egyptian life, the relief of shade after hours in the sun, the taste of fresh water after a long thirst, the laughter of your children, the shared song around a smoky fire, the brief camaraderie with fellow workers during a festival. These are the threads that wove the tapestry of your days, simple and often coarse, but real. You recall the fear of the overseer's rod, the gnawing hunger, the pain of illness, the grief of loss. These too are indelible parts of your experience. There will be no scribes to record your life story, no elaborate tomb to preserve your name for posterity. You are one of the anonymous millions upon whose backs this great civilization was built. Your joys, your sorrows, your hopes, your fears, they will vanish with you, like footprints in the desert sand erased by the wind. The historical record, with its focus on kings and priests and battles, will have no space for your humble narrative. You are destined to become forgotten dust. This is the ultimate, unpalatable truth for most people who lived in ancient Egypt, and indeed, for most people throughout much of history. The enduring monuments speak of power and eternity, but the silence of the common graves speaks of anonymity and the relentless turning of time. As the light dims, as the sounds of the village fade into a gentle hum, you feel a sense of release perhaps. The struggle is almost over. The endless toil will cease. The demands of gods and men will no longer weigh upon you. There is a quiet resignation, a letting go. You hope for a peaceful passage to the field of reeds, for judgment in your favour in the hall of Mayat. You hope your family will remember to make the small offerings, to keep your spirit alive in their memories, at least for a little while. The ancient world, with all its harsh beauty and brutal realities, slowly recedes. The heat of the Egyptian sun on your skin becomes a distant memory. The rough linen of your garments no longer scratches. The taste of gritty bread and sour beer fades from your palate. You're drifting now, away from the banks of the Nile, away from the mud brick huts and the towering stone temples. The voices grow softer, the air cooler, the light gentler. And now, dear listener, as our journey through the less glamorous side of ancient Egypt concludes, allow your own senses to soften. Feel the comfort of your bed, the gentle weight of your blanket. Let the images of toil and hardship recede, replaced by the quiet darkness of your own peaceful room. The struggles of that ancient peasant are not yours to bear any longer. You have witnessed a life far removed from your own, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in even the most challenging of circumstances, but it is time to let that world fade completely. The whispers of the past are quieting now, becoming just a soft echo. There is only the stillness of the night, the gentle rhythm of your own breath, and the promise of rest. Relax, and let the last vestiges of that ancient dusty land dissolve into the tranquility of your impending sleep.